We must choose between a world of fear and a world of progress. We cannot stand by and do nothing while dangers gather.
He has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes.
We must stand up for our security and for the permanent rights and the hopes of mankind. By heritage and by choice, the United States of America will make that stand. And delegates to the United Nations, you have the power to make that stand as well. Thank you very much.
(1945), and the United States of America is the most powerful military force in the world. It drops 2 atom bombs on Japan, killing almost 300,000 people. America is still the only country to have used nuclear weapons in war.
Main Street, USA, at peace, unaware that a cabal of conspirators plots its enslavement.
For the next 50 years, America fights the Cold War. It intervenes in country after country to save the world, it says, from communism.
In this Guatemalan town of Equipulas, just occupied by anti-government forces, are the first evidences of that much-publicized anti-communist revolution.
Guatemala is one of the first targets. Here, the US topples a democratically elected government. 45 years of murder and massacre follow. The 1950s. Iran, too, has a democracy. The United States undermines it and enthrones an unelected Shah.
46 were wounded, 2 killed under questionable circumstances. Castro, in a broadcast speech lasting most of the night, says bombs from U.S.-based planes are responsible for the casualties.
1961 sees the United States secretly fund a military invasion of Cuba. It tries repeatedly to assassinate Cuban President Fidel Castro. 3 years later, the United States sponsors a military coup in Brazil. Another democratically elected government bites the dust, and Brazil gets 21 years of brutal military rule. But it's in Vietnam that America's Cold War really catches fire. It drops more bombs on North Vietnam than the total dropped on Germany, Italy, and Japan during World War II. At least 3 million people die. But America still makes time to take undercover action in many other countries across the world. One is Chile, where it engineers a military coup. Thousands are tortured and killed. The 1990s brings the fall of the Soviet Union, in effect its defeat in the Cold War. The world looks forward to the end of the arms race and a peace dividend.
With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism, state communism, Stalinism, whatever you call it, then the United States empire was able to emerge absolutely dominant. I mean, with a military budget greater than the 9 largest budgets in the world, bigger than Russia, China, France, Britain, Turkey, Israel all put together. In the immediate post-war period, President Eisenhower said that the only basis for international relations is respect. And he said, he's an old soldier from the First World War, and soldiers don't like war. Eisenhower said every warship built is a theft from the poor. I mean, most amazing statement he made. But this new Republican Party of Reagan and Bush, the so-called neocons, they realized they were in a supreme military position, and they planned what they call themselves full spectrum dominance, to dominate the world by space, land, sea, air, and information. I think information is the most powerful of all, funnily enough.
In the United States, the overwhelming justification for invading Iraq was 9/11. Most people in the United States still believe that Iraqis were behind the attack on the World Trade Center.
Imagine those 19 hijackers with other weapons and other plans, this time armed by Saddam Hussein.
Iraqi officials deny accusations of ties with al-Qaeda. These denials are simply not credible. Last year, an al-Qaeda associate bragged that the situation in Iraq was, quote, good.
Take one vial, one canister, one crate, slipped into this country to bring a day of horror like none we have ever known.
But was the day of horror really anything to do with Iraq?
The intelligence leads before 9/11 were very extensive. 11 countries, including most of the major European countries and certainly the UK, provided detailed intelligence evidence. Mossad, which is well known to have very good contacts, about a month or 2 months before 9/11, two key representatives of Mossad went to Washington and provided both the CIA and the FBI with a list of 200 named terrorists, as they called them, who were planning a spectacular attack on the American mainland. We know that at least 4 of those named were amongst the 20 hijackers. Those names were given to the US authorities. They were not arrested. On the day of 9/11 itself, it inexplicably failed to get fighter aircraft scrambled in order to intercept the 4 hijacked civil airliners, even though there was an hour and a half in which that could have happened, and even though there were American warplanes only 10 miles to the west of Washington. The only planes that were scrambled were from much more distant bases, and for reasons again that have never been explained, they flew at only a third to a half of their capacity speed and were not there when the attacks were finally made on the buildings. And after 9/11, the Americans showed rather less interest than one might have expected in capturing bin Laden, even though 2 of the Pakistani Islamist parties offered to extradite him in order to stand trial. So It looked as though the American government had other reasons, and I believe they did. And I also quoted evidence which shows that the Americans were clearly planning war, first on Afghanistan, second on Iraq, before 9/11.
You notice that the country which is in the line of fire at the moment, Iraq, is about the only secular state in the Middle East. It's the state perhaps with least to do with this Islamic fundamentalist terror network of any state in the Middle East.
The hijackers came out of Saudi Arabia, if Osama bin Laden comes out of Saudi Arabia, if Khalid Muhammad, who planned the logistics of the attack, came out of Saudi Arabia, and let's face it, the money came out of Saudi Arabia, then why weren't we in Saudi Arabia as opposed to Baghdad?
I certainly do not believe for a second that the American government or any government in the world deliberately planned the slaughter of 3,000 of its own citizens. I don't believe that for a second. But I do believe that they were looking for a pretext. They may have believed that something was going to happen. They may have believed that something like a hijack could happen and that would be useful to them. I simply don't know. But when it turned out to be on a vast scale, and the killings were, and the destruction was far greater than anyone could have, I think, imagined, I can imagine that there was a great deal of panic. Rumsfeld, within hours of the attack on the Twin Towers, was demanding from his staff evidence which would justify an attack on Iraq. And he asked the CIA 10 times to come back with that evidence. And even though they failed actually to make the connection on the basis of any detailed evidence, he nevertheless continued to demand the right and the opportunity to attack Iraq. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And 9/11 was not planned by the United States for that purpose. Of course it wasn't. But it was a very useful pretext for what they wanted to do anyway.
Most of the world now believes the main reason the United States invaded Iraq was because of oil. The world's supply of oil is fast running out, 15 years to go according to some estimates, and of what's left, Iraq has the biggest single share after Saudi Arabia. The economy of North America would fall apart without cheap oil. Could it have a stronger cause for going to war?
I don't think there is any question whatever that a major reason for the attack both on Afghanistan and Iraq was to get control of the remaining oil supplies. We all know that America is easily the largest fossil fuel burner, and the amount of oil and gas which the Americans use for their own consumption, which is available to them from the United States mainland, has steadily gone down over the last 20 years from something like 60 to 40%, and it can be expected to continue to decline quite markedly. So I don't think there's any doubt that that was a major motive. Whether it was the only motive, whether there was a political motive in having a platform in the Middle East in order to support Israel, in the minds of some of the members of President Bush's administration, that may have been so as well.
Since the beginning of the last century, control of the oil-producing areas of the Middle East has been a top priority for Western countries. First Britain, then America dominated the area through their patronage of Arab monarchs.
King Faisal wearing a cream and gold uniform, salutes the Queen with a charming gesture and receives in turn a warm family welcome.
But 1958 brought violent change.
Without warning, revolution has swept away the young King Faisal of Iraq and his uncle Crown Prince Abdul Ilah. Iraq becomes #1 danger spot. Veteran Premier Nuri Es-Said is deposed, he has fled, and the Republican rebels have offered £10,000 for his arrest. The tide of Arab nationalism is again in flood.
Back in 1958, when the Iraqi nationalist coup, military coup, was the first break in the Anglo-American condominium, the decision was that any further interference with U.S.-British domination of the oil resources of the region would be intolerable and would be resisted by a ruthless force.
Saddam Hussein was a ruthless young nationalist whose party took control of Iraq in a violent coup. In 1974, he nationalized Iraq's oil industry. He tortured and terrorized his enemies and poured money into health and education. For years, the United States and Britain did business with him and even armed him in his fight against Iran. But later he fell out of favor. His crime was to break the unwritten rules of the oil business.
Oil guys have a set of ethical rules on how they operate, and it works the same in Texas as it does in Saudi Arabia. And so what Saddam did is he broke the etiquette of the oil field. Just before the invasion of Kuwait, Saddam Hussein asked the ambassador to Iraq from the United States, what happens if I invade, if I go into Kuwait? And you understand why he did so. During the Iraq-Iran war, Iran destroyed the southern oil fields of Iraq, which sat on a shared oil pool with Kuwait. They had a joint drilling agreement. So the Kuwaitis were pulling out all the oil, while the Iraqis couldn't drill oil. So in effect, Kuwait was stealing all the oil from underneath the southern field of Iraq. Now, George Bush Sr., being an old oil man, knows what happens when you steal someone else's oil. In Texas, because he was in Texas. In fact, very similar thing was called the Permian Basin. In Texas, you have one big pool of oil in the center called the Permian Basin. George Bush drilled there. He had joint production agreements with different drillers. If someone in Texas, if his well shut down for a fire or some reason, and someone else started sucking out his oil out of that same pool, what he would do is he'd take a few guys with some baseball bats and go into their saloon and break their kneecaps. Well, this was the same story as in Texas. He basically told Saddam, you go in and break their kneecaps. But the assumption was that what Saddam would do is move 10 miles into the oil fields of Kuwait, seize some of the oil wells and say, well, we're going to even things up. These are ours for a while until we get back our oil. That's how the oil men do it. But then Saddam, moving 10 miles into Kuwait, realized that there was nothing between him and Kuwait City. And his arrogance and his assumption that they didn't say anything about the first 10 miles, why not go all the way to Kuwait City? And that violated the rules, because that's what you don't do in Texas. You can break someone's kneecaps, but you don't rape their wife.
The result was the first Gulf War of 1991. 30 countries, led by the United States, Britain and France, devastated a country with virtually no air defenses. 100,000 Iraqis died. Allied casualties were around 100.
The Iraqi people have been liberated from a dictator. Iraq is on an irreversible course toward self-government and peace.
West has absolutely nothing against authoritarian regimes. The United States, for example, enthusiastically supported Mussolini, supported Hitler into the late 1930s because he was a moderate defending against the Bolshevik threat. It supported Saddam Hussein while he was just torturing dissidents and murdering Kurds and so on. There's absolutely nothing against authoritarian regimes. Supported the Brazilian neo-Nazi generals and so on. It's irrelevant whether the regime is fascist, democratic, socialist, non-socialist, whatever, if it doesn't accept the third world service role, providing markets and resources and cheap labor and investment opportunities and so on. If it doesn't agree to be integrated in the manner that the rulers of the world want, it's unacceptable.
No one argues that Saddam Hussein was not a tyrant, but was it his tyranny that led to the war? Or was it that he simply challenged United States authority? In the years running up to the invasion, Saddam behaved in ways which caused increasing anger in Washington, D.C.
You had a dual problem going on for the United States. Saddam was pulling his oil in and out of the market. One week he'd say, "Okay, I'm going along with the UNSCOM regime, and I'm now going to sell 2 million barrels of oil a day into the market and the Food for Oil program. He's a good boy, a nice steady supply of oil." And then he'd say, in support of the Intifada or in support of St. Patrick's Day, "I'm cutting off the oil today." And suddenly the market would jump up in price. Then he'd suddenly flood the market again and the market would crash.
It was a question of credibility. Because as long as you have someone who is defying the United States and survives, gets away with it, that's the wrong message. That makes the whole system more costly.
While he's jerking the market, you got Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, who's completely out of control, who's saying, you know, Venezuelan oil for Venezuelans. Well, you know, that's a pretty cheeky damn thing to be saying to the Bush family. Clinton didn't mind, but the Bush family says, excuse me, that's Exxon's oil.
Everyone starts thinking, well, I can push the envelope a bit. I can disobey a bit. And in some cases, I can disobey a lot. Maybe I can do something really different. And then you have to expend energy on dealing with all of these challenges. Whereas if you deal with the problem and you show that if you disobey, you will be crushed, then that's got systemic benefits.
Plus, there was tremendous political pressure on America, on George W. administration. They went into Afghanistan, but they never found Osama bin Laden. They never smashed al-Qaeda. The economy's going down. Bill Clinton had left the American economy in high spirits, high employment, high stock market, and $1 trillion surplus. Within short order, the Bush family had just blown the money out the window. And now Americans are asking, where's my pension? Where's our tax money? What happened? And the answer was, we got to get Saddam.
The United States has no quarrel with the Iraqi people. They've suffered too long in silent captivity. Liberty for the Iraqi people is a great moral cause and a great strategic goal.
Removing Saddam will be a blessing to the Iraqi people. 4 million Iraqis are in exile, 60% of the population dependent on food aid, thousands of children die every year through malnutrition and disease.
The United States and its allies have failed to bring security to the Iraqi people. Murder, rape, and robbery are commonplace. A country with an ancient culture and long civilization has been reduced to chaos. United States soldiers remain in control and are feared and mistrusted by millions of Iraqis.
Over there, people can be snatched from their homes at in the middle of the night and literally disappear. There is no appeal. There's no one to speak to. There's literally no one to confront. You know, if a mother's son is snatched in the middle of the night, he can disappear and disappear for good. Life now is much worse than it was before. Life, there is the obvious deficiencies: water, electricity, schools, and so on and so forth. I mean, the River Tigris, is stuffed full of ordnance, depleted uranium, bodies. I mean, that's, if you can imagine river in this country being polluted in that way. So no, it's not about improving the life of the Iraqi people. The hospitals in Baghdad are stuffed full of people who are, been shot, stabbed, wounded, burned, terrible burns. They don't have the medicine to treat them. Many of them are going to die. So it's absolutely credible, taking into account the numbers of people being shot, the numbers who are the children who are dying. Infant mortality rate is skyrocketed. That there are 1,000 dying a week.
لا مي لا اول لا ثاني بهدلني شلع قلب الجهنم مرضي المي لوثه شلع قلبنا من جاء علينا يحرر بغداد وسوى بغداد هو طلع عمل من عندهم.
Some of the biggest losers are the 52, 3, 4, 5% of the population who are women and girls, and they are literally living in a climate of fear. And I mean, if subjecting more than half the population, 12, 13, 14 million Iraqis to that is a humanitarian war, then I'm Tony Blair.
Killing, rape and abduction of women happens on a daily basis, and no one is held responsible for that. And certainly the American occupying forces are not taking any measurements, or they are not there to protect women's rights or people in particular, because they are there to protect America's political and economic interest in that area, in that region. Girls are being raped. I have interviewed girls of 10 and 12 years old and 15 years old who have been raped numerous times. Women are being kidnapped. There are figures that perhaps 400 or 500 have been snatched from the streets on their way to work or on their way to the shops in the last few months, more or less since the end of the war. Most of the women you see now are veiled because they are just scared of the Islamic forces, not because they believe in being veiled, because women before were highly educated and they were working and they have presence in every public life, but at the moment they don't. They are just unemployed at home, and plus they are being veiled, and rape and killing and abduction is taking place on a daily basis.
We will supply humanitarian relief, bring the economic sanctions to a swift close, and work for the long-term recovery of Iraq's economy. We'll make sure that Iraq's natural resources are used for the benefit of their owners, the Iraqi people.
Iraq's for sale, but few, it seems, want to buy. The country is still effectively at war, and who knows what the future will bring.
Today, Iraq finds itself poor because of the astonishing mismanagement of the Iraqi economy over the last 4 decades.
The United States claim that the real hope for Iraq's future lies in the free market. Iraq industries and services are being privatized. Foreign companies, mostly from the United States, have been encouraged to buy up formerly state-owned companies.
This is a turning point. Do we have a liberation or a conquest? And so far it's not looking very good, because we have a virtual invasion of U.S. lobbyists rewriting the laws of Iraq. Like the recording industry of America, Microsoft, these guys are sending in their lobbyists to rewrite the laws of Iraq.
Privatization in Iraq, this is to deprive the whole population of its inheritance, its heritage, and its country, because they're going to sell everything to the highest bidder and basically reduce the Iraqi people and the people around them in the area into coolies.
The decree says all profits may be repatriated immediately. 100% foreign ownership is allowed in all sectors apart from energy, and there'll be a tax holiday this year and a cap of 15% on business tax thereafter.
We impose free markets on third world countries in order to be able to rob them more efficiently. But no advanced industrial society would accept that regimen for a minute, except under particular circumstances. So when Britain ruled the world, it shifted to free market ideology. So from around the middle of the 19th century, after Britain had destroyed alternative competitors and was well in front, it became passionately in favor of a free market until about the 1920s, when the Japanese and others were starting to undercut British production, so the empire was closed off to Japanese exports. Free market is fine if you're going to win the game, but if you're not going to win the game, you turn to state power to protect you.
Iraqi people, they have no trust whatsoever in the Americans or the British. They are always blew ill wind to Iraq. They brought Saddam, and they brought before them the monarchy, and what they are trying to do now. For instance, they want to build a constitution with the thumbs and the hands of the Americans all over it.
The ruling council is being put together by America, CIA mainly choosing them, and they consist of the tribal leaders, religious leaders, and the nationalist parties. And they try to oppress the radical and secular forces within Iraqi society, such as our organization and also the Union of Unemployed, which was founded and that has more than 130,000 members across Iraq because people were unemployed. So they established this organization, this union, to demand their rights, either jobs or insurance, like $100 a month, because people have lost jobs and they have no resources, no incomes. But America actually, instead of providing these people with something, they have arrested 55 members of the Union of Unemployed in their leadership who were carrying out a strike. So this is the kind of agenda they have in Iraq, which is to impose every kind of secular progressive movements and promoting the most tribal right-wing reactionary forces in Iraq and bring them into power.
They were assuming that the democracy they would impose on Iraq would be democracy Afghan style. And as we've seen, bringing in CIA agents or people who've been on the payroll of the US intelligence agencies hasn't solved anything in Afghanistan. We shouldn't forget Afghanistan, by the way, because they're having a lot of problems in there already. So they can't make it work in Kabul. Iraq is a country much, much more advanced socially, politically, culturally. This is a country with a real infrastructure, a country with a very rich history of struggle, a country where people do not want to be occupied.
Iraqi, out Iraqi. You want me out of Iraq? Out Iraqi. I'm sure.
No, because you know what? I am the reason that you're here to speak freely. I am here only. I am here is the reason that you're able to speak freely.
I don't need you.
Okay, then you leave.
I don't need you.
You leave. You leave or we take you away. You leave or we take you away.
After liberation, the streets in Basra and Baghdad are sure to erupt in joy.
The jubilation on the faces of ordinary Iraqis as they realized that the grip of fear that had them by the throat had been released.
there are very few people in the country who don't or haven't at some time thought, you know, from my experience of speaking to them, that they would at least consider taking up a gun.
The ragged people in the fields with their Kalashnikovs, dancing on an American helicopter gunship which they'd shot from the sky. It killed at a stroke the racist nonsense that uniquely amongst all the people in the world, the Iraqis were going to welcome foreigners invading their country and occupying it and beginning to steal their wealth.
Nobody invited them to the country. Nobody wanted them in the country. I don't think we need them there either, because the cities and towns where they did not set foot in it, there is no looting, no burning, no theft. Security was good, and people controlled themselves very much better than the cities and towns where they went in.
The US soldier is critically ill after being shot at point-blank range in Baghdad this morning. Local people said he'd just left a cafe carrying 2 Pepsi cans and was speaking to students outside Baghdad University when a passerby said, "Hello, mister," and fired a single shot at his head.
There are some who feel like that, you know, the conditions are such that they can attack us there. My answer is bring them on.
Saddam Hussein is still lionized by some, more because he symbolizes a strand of nationalism. There are other strands. There is a strong Islamic nationalism, very strong Islamic nationalism, in fact. And there are many nationalists and progressive nationalists who want a different future, who I think take up guns, but would not in any sense regard themselves as supporters of Saddam Hussein.
The attacks against the Iraqi people and against the infrastructure of Iraq and against the coalition are being conducted by small groups of desperate men.
I've seen groups, squads of young men at night after curfew, armed with rocket-propelled grenades, setting up ambushes for US Humvees or Bradleys, the lighter armoured vehicles, in other words. And they could fire scarves across their faces, but people know who they are.
It's not the size of the dog in the fight that counts, it's the size of the fight in the dog. And the Iraqis every day are now killing American soldiers on the streets of Iraq. Every day they're wounding more. And every American soldier is walking down every street knowing that this might be his last walk down any street.
It's a terrifying experience to drive in one of those Humvee troop jeeps. First of all, they're barely armoured at all. I think I was told by one of the soldiers they can stop anything up to 7mm or around about 7mm bullet, which means you're exposed to attack from any kind of weapon virtually on the streets in Iraq, let alone a hand grenade or a bomb. So they're actually terrified, I think, to go out on those patrols. And several of the soldiers I've spoken to in Baghdad, including some women soldiers actually, young women soldiers in their early 20s, told me how nerve-wracking it was, literally thinking that this could be the last time I step out of this compound.
The American troops were ambushed on a main road into Chaldea, a volatile area where attacks on US soldiers are frequent. Witnesses at the scene say that troops may have been killed in the attack, but the US military in Baghdad are maintaining that only 2 men have been injured.
I don't think what we're hearing is the number of American soldiers that are being killed on a daily basis, because American opinion is also turning against this war, and this is becoming George Bush's Vietnam. And I suspect that pressure on George Bush and Tony Blair will increase every single day to pull the troops back. These are working class men and women in the main that are getting killed just to get George Bush re-elected and to make a small minority of people incredibly rich on Iraq soil.
British troops being psyched up for battle.
What are you going to do with one hand on the weapon? The enemy's going to laugh at you!
In the end, many of Saddam's soldiers may just surrender, but if they don't, this is what they can expect from the Parachute Regiment, some of the toughest troops in the British Army.
The image which actually does really stick in my mind is that of Tony Blair, open shirt, lifting up the Iraqi child, kissing him, acting like this great liberator. And that really, really sickened me, because being so aware that this man, pretending he's bringing democracy to Iraq when he's just destroyed that country, this man who knew the impact of the sanctions on that country, who basically enforced them, killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children, causing havoc in that country, is now presenting himself as some kind of liberator of those people.
If Blair had said to Bush, look, I'm sorry, this is a breach of the Charter, we are totally committed to it, I cannot go along with you, Bush would have had the military power to do it, but American opinion would not want to have gone alone for fear of another Vietnam. So that actually the political cover given gave Bush the domestic support, and if it had been withdrawn, Bush would have thought very, very hard before he went to war. So in that sense, I think Blair could have vetoed the operation if he'd wanted to do so.
It is totally incomprehensible to me. Was it because of his ambition? Was it because he felt that it was the only way that he could be the second most important man in the world? I, unfortunately, do not believe that it was because he was torn by his conscience and because he cared about the people of Iraq. Because if he cared for the people of Iraq, the situation in Iraq wouldn't be as it is today, and he would have fulfilled and he would have stood by the promise that he made that the UN was going to play a vital role in Iraq. Where is the UN? And where is Prime Minister Blair promised that he was going to do that?
Blair always does what power wants him to do. That he will always take the line of least resistance, and the most powerful man on earth at the moment is George Bush, and for Blair it's just ingrained, it's instinctive that he sides with where the real power lies, and it would go completely against his nature to do otherwise.
Why he did it? He felt it would give him his place in history. He felt that it makes Britain look powerful by getting under the wing of the eagle. In reality, it's made us look weak, look pathetic, and look isolated in the world.
Britain is a major imperialist power. It's second only to the United States of America. It's the oldest imperialist power. It has interests, global interests, all over the world, and especially in the Middle East. On the question of the Middle East, it chose to throw in its lot with the United States, using the umbrella of US military power to allow it to punch above its weight in the world against the other European powers.
The stain on Mr. Blair's hand will not out. All the perfumes of Arabia will not extinguish it, and it will follow him to the grave and beyond the grave through every history book.
The most powerful memory for me was the 1 million people plus that were on the streets of London in that great day. People of all ages, of all sexes, of all shapes and sizes, just the whole of our nation having risen, saying to the government, not in my name. I've got no doubt that we've learned a lesson, how to mobilise people, how to involve our communities, no more so than those trade unionists within the communities, within our towns and our cities, that travelled in their hundreds of thousands like others to come to London, to Manchester, indeed to many other parts of our country. I was so proud, along with everyone else, to be there that day. It really was an historical occasion, and let no one doubt that in itself it was not only unique, it did have an effect, and it will continue, of course, to have an effect on politics in our country, because it was new politics. It was, at the end of the day, grassroots activism. It was direct action.
The populations of Europe found themselves totally isolated and cut off from the political rulers in their countries, which is an indication of the debasement and degeneration of the democratic process that we have been seeing now slowly taking place over the last 10 years.
The third week of the war, in 91, 100,000 Iraqis were dead. So now, this time, the world was focused on it, and that could not happen again. They couldn't carpet bomb Basra the way they did in '91. And so it just shows that political action makes a difference. We shouldn't say that because the war wasn't stopped that political action failed. It didn't. It saved thousands of lives.
What I think is remarkable about this one, if you compare it with previous wars, only a very small minority of people continued to oppose the war after they started. If you look, the Falklands War, very small number of people. Even the first Gulf War, fairly small number of people. This time, the latest opinion poll I saw from The Guardian, which admittedly they didn't publish till after the war, showed 42 or 43% were always opposed to the war right the way through it. Now I think, again, that view was certainly not reflected in the media or in any of the institutions of society. But I do believe, again, that is a fundamental change. So I think we are building a much stronger current of people who are anti-war and a much stronger anti-imperialist current within that, who not only are against war for reasons of basic humanity, but who do see that there is a motor towards war, which is being driven particularly by the Americans, but by the British and the other big powers as well, which will only lead to more and more wars.
If you marched and if you brought pressure on the Labour government, then you must surely understand that the huge crisis which the government is in over the Iraq policy in general and the question of weapons of mass destruction in particular is the doing of the anti-war movement. And I think Tony Blair put it this way. He said that he was very worried that a long war would lead to his Vietnam, that they would get bogged down in Iraq, that it would be a quagmire. And I think he's missed the point. It can turn into his Vietnam after a military victory. We also hear both from Blair and from George Bush and Rumsfeld that they have plans to threaten Iran and Syria and possibly North Korea. And I think that we must bear in mind that for them, this is an episode in a longer war. And so for us too, it must be an episode in a longer struggle to prevent war.
I am concerned about our future, the future of our children. I feel that President Bush is a very dangerous man. And one of the reasons why I feel that is because I feel that unfortunately Iraq is not the only country that he will go after.
Well, I think Dick Cheney told us the future. He told us that we're in an era of permanent war. He speaks for the superpower. We speak for the other superpower. We say that we're in an era of permanent anti-war. They say this will be a new American century. We say we're determined that it should be a new human century. A century where we don't have a situation where 1 in 5 people in the world doesn't have access to drinking water, where half the people in the world doesn't have access to a toilet, where people endure famine while others feast, and above all, where billions, trillions of dollars are burned, literally burned, as weapons of massive destruction, usually on poor people's countries, usually destroying the lives of poor people in the third world. We are determined that the 21st century will be a better one than the 20th, even if Mr. Cheney is determined that it should be even worse.
We've had some people saying, we didn't stop the war, we had the biggest demonstration. What I would say to them is we achieved a remarkable amount. This is not the time, this really isn't the time to sit back in our armchairs and do nothing. Iraqis are resisting with their life every single day against this occupation. The very least we can do is be out on demonstrations, get involved in these local Stop the War coalition groups, and let's make sure that they don't do this to any other country.
It's in the name of Bush, of Cheney and Powell. It's in the name of arms dealers, in the name of power. It's in the name of oil and all the truth that it brings, but it ain't in my name. Oh no, not in my name. Oh no, not in my name.